Welcome to today's euphoniously titled talk, Murder, Malice, and Mayhem in the 18th Century and Today, Responses in Graphic Media with Elizabeth Rudy and Mark Thomas Gibson. I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. This talk is part of Print Month, which is held in conjunction with the IFPDA Fine Art Print Fair, which is online today through November 1st. This talk is the final in the series, A Closer Look, Prints Then and Now, which was co-organized by the Print Council of America and the International Print Center of New York, IPCNY, with support from the IFPDA Foundation. The series pairs a print curator with an artist from IPCNY's ongoing exhibition, Living in America, to share insights through close looking at prints from their respective curatorial and studio practices. Today's talk, Murder, Malice, and Mayhem, pairs curator Elizabeth Rudy with artist Mark Thomas Gibson. Elizabeth Rudy is the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Associate Curator of Prints in the Division of European and American Art at Harvard Art Museums. Elizabeth is responsible for the objects in the museum's print collection, which spans the Renaissance to the contemporary era. Her research focuses on prints of the 18th and 19th centuries, with particular interests in etching, book illustration, and works by the artist Pierre-Paul Prud'hon. Mark Thomas Gibson received his BFA from the Cooper Union and his MFA from Yale. Gibson's work was most recently on view in the solo exhibition, The Dangerous One, at the Rosenwald Wolf Gallery at University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and of course at IPCNY and Living in America. In 2016, Gibson co-curated the traveling exhibition Black Pulp with artist William Villalongo at the Yale School of Art. The show examined evolving perspectives of Black identity in American culture and history from 1912 to 2016. In 2016, Mark released his first book, Some Monsters Loom Large, with funding from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. The book was recently reissued in partnership with IPCNY. His second book, Early Retirement, was released in 2017. He's currently an assistant professor of painting at Tyler School of Art and Architecture, Temple University, and lives and works in Philadelphia. Elizabeth will be presenting first, followed by Mark, and then a conversation between the two. We will be taking questions from viewers towards the end of the program, which will be moderated by Judy Hecker, director of the IPCNY, and Shelley Langdale, head of the Print Council of America. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. And before we begin, I would be remiss if I did not thank Shelley Langdale of the Print Council of America and Judy Hecker at the IPCNY for developing this series and sharing it on our platform. It is so gratifying to see these Zooms we had back in the early zombie apocalypse days of March come to fruition with these conversations, which have been enjoyed by many hundreds of viewers from more than 25 countries. And by the way, if you're joining us today from the US, please vote. And thank you, Judy and Shelley. With that, I will turn over the program to Elizabeth Rudy.
Good afternoon. Please bear with me. I'm going to share my screen now. I'd like to thank everyone who had a hand in organizing this wonderful series of programs, which I've enjoyed so much as a member of the audience. Judy Hecker of the IPCNY, Shelley Langdale and Mary Weaver Chapin of Print Council, and Jenny Gibbs and Shara Young of IFPDA. And of course, I'd also like to thank my co-presenter, Mark Thomas Gibson, who will join me at this virtual podium shortly. So, on this Halloween Eve, at the near close of Print Month, and just days away from a portentous election, what better topic than murder, malice, and mayhem? I will start things off by taking us back to 18th century France, and then Mark will speak about these issues in today's society and in his work. My presentation will center on one individual, Antoine François Desrues. His name appears in contemporary accounts with two alternate spellings, but the one at the top of this slide is by far the most common. He was a spice seller in Paris who was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated murder and put to death by the French state. Specifically, he was condemned to public torture and then burned alive on May 6, 1777. His ashes were then scattered and onlookers tried to grab them to keep as relics. On the day of his death, this text recounting his life and demise was available for sale. The full title exposes the dual aim of the text that follows. It denounces Desrues as not only a bad actor who carried out heinous crimes, but as a rotten character who had been amoral since birth. The text was identified as a brochure by the author. It It was small to fit comfortably in the reader's hand, and it was meant to accompany 40 illustrations, 3 of which I'm showing here. The images are about 3 times the width of the pages. The experience of reading the two bound together, as you see here, is not unlike that of a modern graphic novel. The scale of the images forces you to put down the text, unwrap the scenes, and take them in. What is more, the images have lengthy captions, which allow them to stand alone, free from the text. But when bound with the brochure, the captions are one more way that the experience of reading is prolonged, protracted, and the primary text interrupted. In the first imprint of the brochure, the etchings are listed with titles and are identified as being sold by a specific pair of print publishers. Before I get any further in my presentation, I'd like to say a few words about how I became aware of and interested in this engrossing object. I first encountered the book while conducting research for an upcoming exhibition at the Harvard Art Museum's Dare to Know, Prints and Drawings in the Age of Enlightenment. The show and its catalog will be the culmination of several years' collaboration between me, my former colleague Edouard Kopp, and Professor Crystal Sementek. It will also include contributions from our project manager, Heather Linton, our new colleagues, Joachim Hohmann and Meg Griselli, and many emerging scholars and postdoctoral researchers. The discovery of the Desrues brochure was a recent one, and it will be exhibited in the section of the show titled Persuade. Here, we will posit questions about 18th century notions of justice, both that which was meted out by the judicial system, and of course, the broader question of justice for all humans in a so-called enlightened society. And now back to Desrues and his gory tale. I've organized my presentation into 4 parts, which I hope will keep the dreaded Zoom fatigue at bay. Part 1, the so-called facts of the case. Our brochure opens with this image, topped by the bold heading, True Portrait of Desrues. The majority of his crimes, relayed in the 100 pages or so, feature theft, fraud, and murder. He is depicted as a lifelong robber of other people's property and cash. In this early plate, his uncle realizes that the young Desrues has broken into his commode and robbed him of his savings. Many counts of his fraud as a private individual and professional salesman are recounted in the brochure as well. Here, Desrues is shown destroying the last copy of a promissory note he had made to his boss for a large sum of money. He convinced her to hand her copy to him. He rips it up and thus eradicates any proof she might have had to reclaim her funds. This is an act he's accused of carrying out several times. Avarice is described as Desrues' overwhelming motivation for all his crimes, an insatiable hunger for status and wealth. But his greatest crime was premeditated murder. After expanding from a retail salesman to a wholesale dealer, Desrues borrowed a large sum of money from the de la Motte family, which was of noble birth. When he made no signs of paying it back, Madame de la Motte and her son came to Paris to put pressure on him. He welcomed them with open arms, already plotting their demise, or so the text says. Here he is hosting them for dinner. The son was quickly dispatched to boarding school, but his mother stayed in the house with Desrues. Realizing she wouldn't be fooled forever, Desrues poisoned her nighttime drink one evening, and by morning, she was dead. After hiding the body for several days, he beguiled a stonemason to help him bury the decomposing corpse in a wine cellar that he had rented out nearby. This is a significant detail, as he would later try to pin the crime on the gullible mason. The de la Motte's son eventually came looking for his mother. Desrues convinced him she was in Versailles, and after traveling there together, he poisoned the boy with a cup of hot chocolate. After several doses over several days, because a sudden death would be too suspicious, Desrues finally killed the de la Motte's son. He insisted to everyone that the teenager had died of a communicable disease, and the boy was buried in Versailles. When his wife and son didn't return home by March 1777, the head of the de la Motte family feared the worst and immediately suspected Desrues of foul play. The authorities were able to find and exhume the bodies of both Madame de la Motte and her son and prove that poison was the cause of both deaths. In these scenes, the body of Madame de la Motte's rather extremely decomposed corpse is found, and there's Desrues on the left of the leftmost image, where he's feigning horror. While the autopsies were being carried out, Desrues fled Paris for Lyon, where he was captured and brought back to Paris for trial. Deroux was convicted and given a harsh but not unheard of sentence. He was to be publicly tortured on the wheel and then burned alive in the Place de Grève. This is another artist's depiction of the execution. As you can see by the building in the center, it is the current site of the Hôtel de Ville in the center of Paris. This is where public executions were carried out in the Ancien Régime. The brochure has another two refrains about Deroux, separate from his crimes and punishment. His false devotion or hypocrisy is mentioned multiple times. He portrayed himself as a devout Catholic, wearing religious relics on his person and visiting often with priest confessors. In this way, he publicly portrayed himself as an honest, trustworthy man, when in fact, he was anything but. Here he is during Lent, praying late into the night and lying on a simple mattress made of straw. His ability to lure and fool people is the second leitmotif of the brochure. When Deroux was captured in Lyon, he had assumed the name of his first victim, Madame de la Motte, and was dressed in women's clothes. He is shown here seated at the right. This moment echoes the beginning of the text on page 4, where it is claimed that Deroux was born a hermaphrodite and lived as a girl until the age of 12, after which he assumed, quote, the distinctive character of the male sex, end quote. When I was discussing this with Mark, my co-presenter today, he rightly described this characterization of Deroux as that of a shapeshifter. That is precisely what the 18th century account was going for, to convince readers that this individual was so dangerous that he eluded easy description and could change his appearance to suit any circumstance, and thus fool anyone. These are some of the words repeated throughout the text to describe Deroux: monster, villain, detestable. They are reinforced by the references to cross-dressing and his supposed hermaphrodism, a claim that is almost certainly false. But later accounts would rely on the visual depictions of the criminal and cite them as proof that he was suspect all along. He had physical attributes of both sexes, they wrote, with delicate facial features and a slight mien. While the story would get told and retold throughout the next century, it was inextricably linked to the images that proliferated at the time too. Part 2, the story the images told. In her article about Deroux's trial and execution, the scholar Annie Duprat explains why the brochure and its images came to be. As she writes, there was growing dissatisfaction in 1777 with the highest sentence of public torture and burning. There were increasingly loud critics among the intelligentsia who claimed that this aspect of capital punishment was inhumane. And in fact, public torture on the wheel, such as Deroux endured, ceased in 1780. At the end of the brochure, as you see in this detail, are the affirmed approvals of the Royal Censor de Sauvigny and the Lieutenant of Police Lenoir. This is their official approval of the contents of the brochure. According to Duprat, this explains the strong voice and length of the brochure. She argues that Lenoir strove to flood the market with texts and images condemning Deroux to silence or mute the critics of the legal system. The brochure was thus an attempt at social control, a way to sway public opinion against Deroux and keep it there. Just like the text, which gets repeated over and over in different voices, but with the same message, the images flooding Paris at the time depicted Deroux in similar ways. And in this, they had a critical role to play in conveying a coherent portrait of Deroux and his criminality. The cotton bonnet, the overcoat with a flower pattern, and most importantly, Deroux's wan, mildly amused expression, the images created an iconography for him that bolstered what the brochure said and showed about him. Or did they? The brochure's illustrations adopted a serial approach, one that was typical for contemporary scandals like that of Deroux. The prints were cheap, relatively small, and they conveyed information in bursts. They are schematic, rendered in a hurried style that suggests that the artist was being efficient, hastening to produce the images as quickly as possible. Other artists portrayed Deroux's story in a similar way, such as this sheet, which repeats many of the illustrations from our brochure. This mode, titled tableau, meaning pictures or paintings in another context, was a typical term used to describe serial imagery like this. Another variation on this mode was the dual broadside. The style of these images, as in the previous work, was even more abbreviated, sketchy, what is often described as amateurish. To give you an example, I'm juxtaposing some gruesome details. Deroux being burned in the brochure illustration on the left, and in the broadside on the right. Earlier examples abound of capital punishment being portrayed in this way graphically. It's a long tradition. I'm showing you two instances here. On the left, the case of Damiens, who tried to assassinate King Louis XV in 1757. And on the right, the torture of Calas, a falsely accused, and convicted merchant from Toulouse, that's 1762. The portrayal of Desrues in the brochure illustrations is tame to our modern eyes. It certainly lacks the confrontation and charge that Mark will soon share in his own work. Desrues is shown in these images not as a monster beyond description, but as a petty, complacent man. While chilling in their placidness, the images illustrate something more like lurid occurrences, faits divers, not the crimes of the century. But that isn't to say these illustrations are contrary to the text in any way. Their power, their impact lay in their number. It was the depiction of every phase of Desrues' evolution as a criminal that did what Lenoir wanted and helped solidify the notion that this criminal deserved to be eradicated. To his dying breath, Desrues maintained his innocence, a fact no one believed, and he never showed even the slightest perturbation at being captured, accused, or convicted. Showing him over and over again with this almost expressionless demeanor amplified the message of the brochure that he was incorrigible, unreachable even. It's worth mentioning that while etching was the main print technique employed in the accounting of Desrues' crimes, the frontispiece of the second 1810 edition of the brochure included this full-length portrait of him in woodcut. All the tools of his calumny are depicted here, the religious symbols, the table full of potions, but it's rendered in the archaicizing language of woodcut. This older technique places Desrues' tale firmly in the long past, in the time of established truth. Serial images like the illustrations to the brochure were not the only types of images proliferating at the time of Desrues' execution. I've already shown a few, and now I'll share some more. Numerous portraits appeared, many of them showing him heading to the gallows, and they often repeated each other, as these two prints do. The lower details in both portraits highlight the technical disparity within this body of work. In other words, not every cheap print portraying Desrues was of the same quality. In the next slide, I'll focus on these details in the lower margins. In the one at the bottom, the scaffold and the pyre are rendered much more finely, and the separation of those elements with a blank space, devoid of crowds or any other detail, is rather haunting in its silence and absence. There's even variation within the frontispiece of the brochure that I've shown in so many slides, and I've included it again here on the left. As you can see, I hope, from the blown up details, Desrues' face is rendered with an economy of lines, several of which are dotted and suggest a hesitation, maybe from copying. The objects littering the foreground, however, the instruments of his crimes, are rather elegantly rendered with confidence. Already in this very first image of the brochure, I think there's a suggestion that multiple hands might be at work to make the images that follow. Part 3, an eternal cause célèbre. For all his crimes, Desrues was hardly a mastermind who would strike fear into the true crime junkie of today. And yet his story made it into 19th century crime annals. The drama of his life seized the imagination of novelists, and he appears in the work of these three well-known authors. While two of them merely allude to Desrues, Alexandre Dumas took a sustained interest in the case and featured it as one of his famous crimes throughout human history. I'm showing you one of the pages from Dumas' text here, where you can see that he has invented dialogue between Desrues, his accomplices, and his victims. Dumas creates a character for Desrues, fleshing him out, as it were, while the rest of it reads like the 1777 brochure, relying on the same condemning words, monster, villain, etc. Desrues also featured prominently in histories of crime, such as the 1861 British text at the top, and he was the subject of a 1906 French history at the bottom, a study which was based on the copious accounts and documents in the National Archives. This author derides the brochure illustrations as hastily printed and poorly executed. Perhaps, but I'd like to end by considering what the prints have to offer us with their anonymity or lack of artist attributions. Part 4, the cloak of anonymity. A colleague of mine makes this joke. Who is the most famous artist of all time? Why, Anonymous, of course, No artist throughout all human history has had more work ascribed to him, her, or them than this famous figure, Anonymous. There are all kinds of reasons why an artist might not sign a work or have their signature included. But in the case of the illustrations I've been discussing today, that was a deliberate, meaningful choice. It's easy to just repeat what I said earlier, that this kind of image making was a genre that didn't warrant scrutiny, that didn't participate in the commerce of fine art. But I think it's worth examining what this anonymity afforded the artists who made the prints and what implicit claims it made to viewers and consumers of the images. The text of the brochure is also unsigned. It has been attributed to André Charles Caillot, whose name appears on the title page as the printer-publisher. Caillot was a prominent figure in Paris and a known author, but for a text such as this one, he chose not to claim his work. The illustrations are not without skill. You can see here in a detail from one of the plates showing the torture of Desrues that the three figures on the scaffold are rendered with specificity, each readily distinct from one another. Another detail I quite like is from one of the plates showing the poisoning of the Delamotte son. Here, the artist has depicted the candlelight as a large swath of reserve, but he's also enveloped the crucifix in this light so that it pops in the overall scene and reinforces the text assertion that Desrues was an audacious hypocrite. For even while committing murder, he feigned devotion. That's his hand there in the lower right corner clutching a prayer book. He's on his knees appearing to pray while his victim slowly perishes in the bed next to him. I think it's entirely possible, as I mentioned before, that the illustrations were executed by more than one artist, perhaps even a team. But their lack of signatures allows them all to work to the same end, to paint, as it were, the same picture of Desrues. As I said in the beginning, the illustrations were listed in the brochure as being sold by print publishers, specifically Jacques Hainaut and Michel Rapilly. They were better known for the fine art prints that they sold, such as this one by the academician Jacques-Philippe Lebas. But as many members of this audience today might attest, having a wide client base has always been the key to commercial success. Sadly, this didn't work out for Hainaut and Rapilly in the long term, as they went bankrupt in 1790. But it's telling how diverse their inventory was, from work by rock star printmakers such as this one, to the unsigned, somewhat uneven illustrations of Desrues' life. The scholar Hélène Duchini prefaces her discussion about the brochure's illustrations by saying that the Desrues case prompted a mediatization of the judicial machine. By this, she means not only the media coverage of the event, its relation in numerous newspapers and journals, but also the flood of images that helped to shape a specific version of those events. Anonymity was the key to this singular vision, and it protected the artists who made the images and the publishers who sold them. Protection was certainly a chief motivation for the images inside the groundbreaking newspaper 12 years later, The Revolutions of Paris. Each issue was accompanied by anonymous, unsigned images. The daily paper relayed events as they were happening from 1789 to 1794, and included etched scenes that have found their way into every history of the period. As historians have argued, the team of printmakers surely included talented artists in need of funds, women artists whose names are just starting to be identified and discussed in current scholarship, and even artists untrained in making prints who were looking for ways to continue to earn a living while contributing to the documentation of history. The cover of Anonymity not only protected the artists who made these images, it also made a claim to rapid truth-telling. There is an implied veracity in the sketchy documentation of events here, as well as an assertion about the artist as eyewitness. Among the copious, unsigned images of Desrues, this one stands out. The directness of his gaze, the protrusion of his right cheek suggesting a bruise or infected tooth. He looks like a pitiful Marat avant la lettre. The artist identifies him or herself with a simple initial X, but this depiction goes beyond the type of economical, often generalized line of the brochure illustrations. Someone in the audience today may recognize this artist's hand. For what more fantastic types of marks could you want from a small etching? The squiggles in the corners, the concentric lines emphasizing the shadows around his left eye. This etching goes beyond the simplified reporting style of the other prints I've shown. And yet it too makes an explicit claim to veracity. In the lower left corner, the artist writes, "Drawn after nature, from life." This and the pseudonym allow the portrayal of Desrues to participate in the same genre as the other images, to assert the authority of unvarnished truth, while obviously being mediated and crafted like the illustrations. I'm going to conclude today with Deru's last victim, whom I haven't yet mentioned, Marie-Louise Nicolet. They were married in the fall of 1772 and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Though she claimed to have no knowledge of his crimes, Madame Deru was convicted as her husband's accomplice. She was sentenced to being publicly whipped and branded and then locked in a women's prison. It was there that she lived until the fateful events of 1792, when, during a raid known as the September Massacres, she was murdered, along with hundreds of prisoners, by the motley mob of revolutionaries, mercenaries, soldiers, and others. It's not entirely clear, from the brochure or the images, whether Marie-Louise was guilty or innocent. The scene depicted here took place in 1779, nearly 2 years after her husband's execution. Perhaps we'll never know whether she was an accomplice or a dupe, because this anonymous mode levels the events it recounts, makes everything equal to a certain extent. And it makes dispassionate, disinterested judgment, especially more than 200 years later, almost impossible. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Mark, to take us into the present moment with all of its horror. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. I'm just like still writing down little things, trying to keep up, because I'm definitely was thinking about the flattening, given the subject of who is anonymous and where that information comes from, the kind of power that comes in that. So thank you. I just want to say thank you to the IFPDA. I also want to say thank you to the FCA. I also want to say thank you to Judy, and obviously thank you to Elizabeth, Rudy, for coming here and speaking with us and offering, I think, for me personally, I think that there's something in the conversation of your research and your study that speaks to a lot of what's happening and occurring at this moment, and how we are disseminating information, how we're receiving information, and how we're not really questioning that information. Maybe more than other times, but not quite to the level I think which is necessary. So I will begin, not to take up any more of our time. So, hi, I am Mark Thomas Gibson. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. This is going to be a brief conversation around my work as it relates to printmaking and how that has kind of come into my practice. How is it a part of my, how it's become increasingly a big part of how I see the world. And hopefully that will become available to all of you as I go through this. So this is a piece called White Flight. It is not a typical print, or what normally typical printmakers would maybe say is a print, but it is using a colograph technique in the background of the painting. It's kind of a merger, it's a mixed media object. I really hate that word, mixed media. Actually, I was talking with archivists yesterday about that, and yeah, we need specificity. So it's ink, and it's also an image where the brick and the formation and the pattern that's behind there is actually performed on another separate form, a matrix, if you will. And then I use the canvas on top of that, and I use a circular sander as almost like a press, using pressure and using a reductive tool such as the spinning blade and the sandpaper to actually make the image come about. I use this image behind several other images to kind of recite location. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about, like how do I bring repetition of space into location? Going back a little bit further, this is Some Monsters Loom Large. On the left is the original drawing image from the original Some Monsters Loom Large, and on the right is the cover for the second edition, which I printed with IPCNY with some extra material in the back. I, for one, was someone who didn't quite understand my relationship as an artist to my subject at an early age. It was kind of a conflicted thing between what do I want to say and what is it that I feel. Not really until I started working on Black Pulp with Will Villolongo did it become clear to me that my subject was the surrounding reality that I live in. Printmaking and print information that runs through print became clearer and clearer to me that there was this rhythm, that there was this logic, that there was this system that was there, and that for me to actually deal with it, I needed to find a pathway into that. So that's actually why I kind of created my first book, Some Launches Loom Large. I developed it as a tale originally just to kind of sit there and I'm going to make these drawings. I was working with a very famous artist, Kara Walker at the time, and she had said to me, well, we're debating on the likelihood that either one of us could ever make a comic book. And eventually she kept saying, you could, and I kept saying, you can. And then she said, you can. And I said, okay, I should probably listen to her. She's Kara Walker. And I said, I'd never been able to think sequentially. Because at this time, I hadn't really even made a print yet as an adult. And it was in this time, it was in this moment where she said, well, you just do one drawing and then you do another drawing. And then I was like, oh, of course, she's a genius. So it started like that at my table, just doing one drawing and then another drawing. And then by the end of it, I had all of these characters. I had a 350-page book. But I knew that the idea and what was behind it was that I had certain specific things that I felt that I'd always tried to do in singular objects and singular things such as paintings, but to actually talk about the horrors of America, to actually talk about my response to those horrors, that it needed to be put into duplication. It needed to operate inside of a multiple. So for the first edition of my book, I did it, 100 copies of it. The FCA, I got an emergency grant through them. The book came out the day right before the show, like I actually had it physically in my hands. And I was able to then offer it to people. And for the first time, watching people go through the book, look at the paintings, recognize, start to develop an understanding around what was being presented in the medium, that they started to actually come to me and actually start talking to me in ways that I've always wanted to communicate. And it was beautiful. It was awesome. Thinking back to Elizabeth's talk, thinking about the idea of information and dispersion of a narrative, the power that a book has, the power that sequential art has, the relationships from left to right, how they stack, how they build. It's pretty incredible because I don't know if it's just a trick or what, but it's so convincing. And then people just are like, it's a little bit like it gets inside of your mind and then you start to assume and then knowledge becomes known or something like that. So in the book, the main character starts off on the small island. He's making these figures, kind of like a sandcastle figure, and he's kind of dealing with his own internal psychology. He's digging a watery grave. In the middle of the ocean, this giant form pops up. He goes out into the ocean to investigate it, and he climbs inside of it. While he climbs inside of it, we also go inside of him, and we find out that there's an earworm that's basically trying to kill him, that's inside of him. This story developed many images for me. And for the first time, I decided I was going to try to put that into an etching. At the time, Will and I started working with IPCNY going forward with the Black Pulp show. Many things kind of came about while working with IPCNY that pushed the story and pushed the narrative and actually clarified a lot of the things and a lot of the subject of the work. It kind of gave voice for me for the first time to really think of how image making is a part of a visual arms race, and a visual arms race is a very important thing inside of our society and something that we're witnessing really at this moment. And so I started to feel like I needed to have that voice and be inside of that space to a greater degree. And I kind of sheepishly, I think I showed this like early print that I kind of had done by myself to Judy, and Judy looked at it and was able to have the eye and the kindness to look at it, and then put me into contact with Greg Burnett, an incredible printmaker who I worked with for several hours to develop my first real, I guess I could say, print. It's taken from a scene from my book, and it's developed around this idea of like the book's just broken into 4 chapters, and it's depicting this character as they're kind of coming into this understanding about their placement actually within inside of our society, within inside of American culture as an African American. And some of that, and some of what that narrative describes is that that's not what is developed in American culture isn't just my pain, isn't just my issue. It is something that we all are sharing. And if anything, more now than ever, are we actually witnessing our interconnectedness, and that there is this kind of like, what has happened to me is actually affecting you. It's affecting the way that you live your life, for better, for worse. And I would say for worse. So the idea of having this banquet, this scene where this character comes to this dinner party, and then all of a sudden, like one of those big chrome dome or silver dome displays gets opened up, and then there's a head, and it's a head that reflects him, and so he realizes that he's in danger. Is something that I think a lot about, especially when traversing different spaces within inside of even the art world, you know. Also with Greg, I made this other piece, which was Boom Boom. It's or Downbeat, but I think of it as Boom Boom. This came later, and this comes from my book, Early Retirement. And Early Retirement was kind of like a beautiful conversation, kind of dealing with like the Trump era, which would become the Trump era. And it started before the Trump actually became president, and kind of trickled in to the presidency as I was making the first book, or making that book. So Early Retirement's a complicated book for me because, as I said, I was working on it before the election. I kind of designed it to it was all about Trump winning the election, and what was going to happen. And if anyone owns a copy of this book or has read this book, now more than ever, and definitely this summer, people have come back to me and they're like, dude, this is exactly what's happening. This is exactly what's happening. And I don't think it was anything prophetic about it. I really think that was simply that it was in the cards, right? The story was telling itself, and we don't want to believe some of the horrific things that were going to occur, but here we are, right? The book, which is a beautifully published book. It actually, every cover is silkscreen white on black. A big part of that development was working with an incredible team in Zurich that helped me, Patrick Fry Editions, that helped me understand like the necessity for each one of these to be a print, to think of them as a print. And I already had that language, so they were caught up with that really quickly. So everything inside the book is double printed black. It's very luxurious. The pages are gorgeous, because I wanted people to hold it in their hand. And also wanted to, it's a very large book, but the weight is deceiving. So I wanted people to hold it in their hand and have a different concept of it. And I also love the idea of the engagement and the durational engagement with the object. So I decided in this presentation to actually show you some of the original drawings, and maybe intermix some of the images that are actually have been reprinted. And so we meet our character at a bar. Trump has been announced as being president. Originally, I had written in the word Trump in there, and then I decided to remove it because I decided I didn't want to put that name to duplication any more than it already was being put into duplication. So I removed it from there. And then there's this moment of like absolute distress from all the individuals in this bar with this character. He calls out to the heavens, cursing out God. He's hit on the head with ball lightning, and he's transported into another dimension. As he's transported into the other dimension, he ends up seeing this thing called the truth. He comes back and he becomes this prophet for the truth. This upsets the president, who then sicks out his lice agents on him. And then the whole world goes into turmoil. There's a whole other weird biblical narrative and strange other things that kind of occur inside of it. It's a kind of an epic tale. But the response from this book for me was kind of incredible because it was doubled, tripled maybe than what I felt with the first book that I made. And that I felt that like all of a sudden I had this a way to like access all of this political language that I always felt that I wanted to work within. And this is where it was offered to me through this book. Pushing forward, I was doing a residency at the McDowell colony. And while I was there, there was an architect who was working on a memorial to slavery in Charlottesville. And the night before the event started happening in Charlottesville, with the march and the horrible anti-Semitic statements being made by white supremacists, we were talking about this amazing symbol of unification in a southern city about the idea of slavery, and then how the community had actually kind of come together to actually honor the lives sacrificed during that kind of horrific and ongoing moment in American history. So we were all kind of kumbayaing in our like little liberal enclave. And the next day, Charlottesville starts to occur. The young woman is murdered, ran over by a white supremacist. And I'm sitting there at breakfast and I say, you know, we need a Negro Rifle Association. We need something that would cause people to be so upset and so freaked out that maybe they would like do something. And maybe they would ban guns. If I went out and I started purchasing AK-47s and putting it in the hands of African Americans, like maybe they would ban it. Once again, thinking in the multiple, taking the industrialized object, trying to figure out how do I use it? How do I use the multiplicity against itself? So then I made this quick drawing. Then I, well, it's a long story short about that presentation in that day, but let's just say not everyone was totally into it. Flash forward about a year, I end up here in Philadelphia, and I'm approached to do a show, and they're like, do whatever you want, go full tilt. And I was like, fantastic. So I decided to bring it back, but this time they make an official flag of it. So I make an official flag, or what seems like an official flag. I go to flag makers. I had to have my wife actually help me, because usually when I'd go to someone and say to them, hey, I want to make this flag, there was a little bit of like a hesitation there. So she said that she was my assistant, and she kind of got it through. And it's a double-sided flag. It's a beautiful object. And it was the first step, right? It was the idea of like presenting this thing as something, bringing on the official air of it. I mean, it was the NRA is actually, just, it's a lobbying group. It's not really an official anything, but they have their flag, they have their thing, they have the red, white, and blue. They put on a lot of different airs and make themselves seem official, that they're not just some kind of extension of a hate group. So I went further. I decided to turn it into this black and white symbol. I made it into a t-shirt. So the idea of the t-shirt was to kind of play against two things. Basically, when you're an artist and you decide to sell objects inside of a show, posters, whatever, swag, most people think that you're just some money grubbing person. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do this t-shirt, but they're going to be 25 bucks a pop. I'm going to edition them. I actually wrote inside of all of them. Each shirt is actually editioned, and I would sell them. Now, what occurred was when I started to sell these things, people would buy them, and people were pretty much thinking, okay, I just bought this shirt. Either I'm supporting the artist, I'm loosely associating myself with some of these like possibly radical ideas. It's a little bit tough. Maybe it's no more than buying a Black Flag t-shirt, whatever. But what occurred was that what I knew would occur is that when people would actually take them and put them in their homes, all of a sudden they were hit. They were struck by this idea that, oh, wait, I don't know if I can wear that. That said, my dad has like several and he loves to wear them. I have, one as well. But then there's those people who they're struck by that. And then in that moment, for those few who have called me, I say, aha, okay. So now you have to deal with the fact that you actually have an art object. It doesn't hang on a wall. It doesn't sit in the middle of your room. It lives in your drawer. And now you're gonna have to contend with it. You're gonna have to decide if you take a t-shirt and you cover it. You have to decide if you keep it at the top of your drawer. You have to decide, how do you contend with it every time that you see it? Where do you sit? How do you align yourself? That for me is what I hope my art does. I used certain modes of representation that may seem cartoony, might seem easy, reproducible. But the idea is that I want that ease to seep through. There's a bit of an anonymity to the line, a bit of an anonymity to the distinction of symbols. And I use that to hopefully push the conversation a little bit further. I recently made this piece, March On, down at Flying Horse Editions. Fantastic group of people. Love working with them. Almost as much as I love working with Greg. Like, I want to see like that weird fight that printmakers have. They're very territorial. I love it. But but seriously, I've been very lucky in my life for someone who didn't have a very steeped printing background to be able to work with such high caliber printmakers and print shops. It's a gift, and I really do think of it as a gift. March On was a piece that was actually kind of a throwaway thing. And then I just kept coming back to it. And I was thinking a lot about Otto Dix and thinking about his World War I series and thinking about like stomping on the print and distortion of the print. And how do we kind of get to this point? And if we disturb the matrix, can we elevate the image beyond maybe its source material into something else? And so March On kind of became that piece. And that's the piece that's right now currently in a show at IPCNY. And it's a lovely little piece. It's deceptive, like the little things I like to do, where you kind of walk in, you see this little thing, and then as you kind of look at it, you kind of get into the horror. And like many ways that we can think about, I think about it right now in this moment, is that if we really sit down and we start really picking apart some of the things that actually occurred, like right here, and there was a man who was murdered in Philadelphia 2 days ago, a mental health issue. It turns out there was a group of people here who were trying to help him get help, who were his advocates, mental health advocates that were trying to get in touch with the police department here to try to tell them, like, this person just has a mental health issue. You don't need to harm this person. And they've been trying to do this for some time, and they never were able to make contact with the police department here. When you get into the micro details of a lot of these tragedies, we find out that there are many people working very hard to stop them from happening. But we're getting to that weird precipice where we're starting to fall over the side of that cliff, and things are going to get dicey. Because underneath a lot of it is a lot of standard old school hatred and ignorance that was embedded in the beginning of this country. Sorry. Let's go a little further. And for my completion of this, I've decided, when you're working as an artist and you kind of have a painting practice and you have a drawing practice, you'll find that many institutions and many spaces won't want you to do work in duplication. The idea of the rarefied singular object in their minds is, I know, equates some sense of value to it. But for me, printmaking is a beautiful tool. It's a beautiful, gorgeous tool. And so what I've decided to do, I have this work called Everyone Should Want One on Their Wall, and it's a dead Klansman. So what I'm doing, I'm going to do it as a large painting, at my standard large scale of 66 by 89. I'm doing it as drawing. I'm doing it as a medium-sized painting. I'm doing it also as a lithograph. I will also be making it as posters. I will also probably be doing it as an etching. I'm going to try to produce it in every way possible, maybe even a photograph, and try to see if I can get it in as many hands and on many walls as I possibly can. Maybe be like a little bit like a little boy blue or something. Because beyond this point, after this election, after everything is said and done, we still gotta do the work. And I believe that working in the multiple, working to create a counter narrative is the only way. So with that, thank you. That's my presentation.
Thanks, Mark. That was fantastic. I learned even more than I have I've seen those, we saw the slides before, we talked about them, but learned even so much more just from your presentation now. Your work is beautiful and conceptually just so riveting. And I wanted to start with the very first piece that you shared, which I believe is behind you. Maybe you could angle your screen so we can get a sense of the scale. Right, so White Flight.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, this links up with some of the other pieces you showed as well, but the potency for you of the reused and repurposed image. Of course, when I see the White Flight, I see George Stubbs. And,
yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the potency of using source material as you described it with Otto Dix, what that meaning has for you, and what potency you think, where you hope that it would have with someone who might recognize it as well.
It's interesting because I think about the image that I know and where it might be coming from. If it's coming from Guernica, if it's coming from Stubbs, Picasso or Stubbs, and I think for me, I love the idea of pulling the direct contact of the horror, or what is informing the horror, off the page. A little bit of a Hitchcockian way of thinking about creating a thriller or creating a little bit of drama in the image. I hope that for those who understand the access points, maybe the art historical access points, that like allows for them to actually have that little moment of consideration of thinking about, where is this pain? Where is this coming from? What is being run from? Maybe the title does it. Maybe that's a little bit too clean and clear and direct. But I hopefully that when I'm looking at an image like that of terror, is that is for me is like a great indicator of like that feeling or that emotion, or that expression. So usually it has to have something there. Then I have to figure out if I can lift it, or if I can elevate it, or if I can be in dialogue with it. Sometimes I actually just draw something, and then after the fact, then it comes to mind. Oh yeah, it's totally like that, or it's. And then if I'm in there, then I might remix it and play with it a little bit more. So usually when I do develop something, I've decided to become a little bit more. Streamlined with where the path of things develop, from drawing to painting to like large scale painting, or becomes large scale painting, and then it comes back into like a collage, and then maybe becomes an etching, and then needs to go back into something else. So there's sort of like, there's becoming like it's a world building tactic perhaps, but it's a way also to create like language and a dialogue between objects and then they start to kind of reinform each other. Yeah, but sorry, go on.
That's great. I have another question, a follow-up question to that. We had a question in the chat about whether white flight is a horizontal or a vertical image.
It's a horizontal image. Right now I have it as a on its side because I need to get too much of my process, but I right now I have it just kind of sitting off to the side, and I was like, okay, either that or this big white blank wall as I'm prepping some other work, and I was like, okay, let me just reposition myself and at least also give some people an idea of scale of the work as well. But yes, no, it's when I store vertically.
Excellent. To follow up on your previous comment, when you were giving your presentation, what you talked about, the interconnectedness you talked about of all of our shared experience right now, resonated with me in terms of how you were talking about your book, the graphic novel, and thinking of all of the different frames being connected and related. And so my question had been before you just made your comment was, what are you going to do another graphic novel? But you just were talking about the multiplicity and working in different media and different modes, and you seeing those aspects as interconnected and resonating in some way. But I don't know if you could just say a little bit more about that.
So the new book, which was supposed to be called Conrad and Conrad, the ballad, like the ballad of, no, it was called The Ballad of Conrad and Conrad, and it was basically about a dead Ku Klux Klansman who goes to hell and then resurrects his Confederate great-great-grandfather, who's his original namesake, Conrad the First. And so he pretty much convinces them that they need to vote for Trump. And so the idea is about them trying to get out of hell and then to vote for Trump. And so that was like something I'd been working on for over a year. And for some reason, it was really hard for me to get around it and to try to really like pinpoint that story, even though I would start it and then stop and start it and stop. So right now, where I am today is similar to what you kind of were asking about, the interconnectedness, is starting to open myself up and having this awareness of the practice that some things might be, some parts of the narrative are evolving more in other aspects of my practice. And now I'm kind of drawing them back into the voice of what it would look like, or what will assume itself to be the graphic novel. So I realized that the ramifications of what's this, I was really trying to press to get it done before the election, but then I realized that the ramifications of this election and the ramifications of the conversation on this election isn't about being first to talk about it. It's really going to be about like taking the time to have a nuanced understanding of it. And so that's what I'm trying to do, rather than trying to be like in real time, like I got all the answers, like I don't. But can I ask you some questions?
Sure, but I think Kelly's going to jump in with a question.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. No, Mark and Elizabeth, thank you guys so much. This has been both of you have shared some really fascinating insights into the whole ideas behind narrative and truth telling and all of that. But we want to be sure to have time for some of our audience to ask questions. Sure. And so I thought we would start with one. Ashley Dunn has asked Elizabeth, How common are the remark-like extra illustrations in the lower margins of the profile portraits of the Derues in the 18th century prints?
Pretty common. That's part of the, it's one mode of portraiture, that you have the primary portrait and then a scene at the bottom of some kind. These are sort of more interesting, I think, because of something actually Mark said about the anonymity allowing him to have a greater freedom or more elasticity to play a little bit. That was what I took from your words, Mark. I think that's true too of these 18th century artists, that they could push the boundaries more because they're not going to be really on the hook for it, so to speak, but also there's more playfulness that's allowed. So I actually was pretty fascinated by those little details. They're easy to overlook in prints like this, but I thought they were quite wonderful.
And a quick follow-up to that, and then I think Judy has some questions for Mark as well. But Catherine Sullivan was curious to know if the Derues publication was impactful in social change of the execution practice, or was it more of a moral tale commentary?
That's a good question. I think it was impactful because it was so widely disseminated, and it had that second, actually there were 3 versions of it. There's the first imprint, the second imprint, and then which had slight variations, but then the 3rd edition in 1810, which retold the story of hermaphrodism, or the myth of hermaphrodism, really. And actually named some, made up some, I don't know, I think they did make up the names of these doctors. They just put like Mr. M **** and Mr. P *** to try to give a little more backstory to this mythology. And the fact that it just kept going, that people just kept talking about it and thinking about it. The issue of guilt was never on the table, but it was more sort of this fascination with someone who could be, who could have committed so many different crimes, that who just wasn't affected, even when he was held to account by society. And so I think in that way it did have a real role to play in terms of change.
Yeah, it was striking to me that it sort of made me think of Lizzie Borden. Judy, did you have
Hi, thank you both so much. Mark, there are a few questions for you. I'm going to throw 2 of them your way. As you know, we're a process-oriented bunch of people, and so there's one question about the kind of changes that happen when you move from drawing to a print matrix, or from to a print matrix, and also a related question about what clicks for you with printmaking in that early aha moment, and then another question that's on a different along a different line is what your work is obviously a statement, a political statement. What do you think the role is of an artist in actually being outspoken as an activist, rather than letting just the work speak? So those are 2 very different questions. If you
complicated,
one or both. Yeah.
Complicated. Okay, I think I can do all, because my brain is popping right now, so I can do it, I think. So drawing for me has always been my first love, and early on when I was a younger person, I was told that I would probably be a good printmaker. I didn't exactly believe them. I didn't like the idea of working with groups of people. I was kind of too much of a loner, and I was young and ignorant. Once I started actually working with a printmaker, and actually remember working on that print for a very long time, and then the print not actually working, but then having this moment of where we actually kind of sat there, and then drawing kind of re-entered into the solution making process to actually getting the print to work. How do I actually interact and play with the matrix? That's where I actually kind of fall in love with it, is that I actually love it when you start working on something and it starts to fail, but yet there's something about printmaking where you can actually like save it, like really come back and save it and come out with when I want to say the win, but I don't really think it's that. It's like this, it's a good parent, it's a good print, it's just like it has meat. And I love the knowledge like that printmakers have. I love just talking about process. I love talking about and thinking through that. And it's a big part of, I thought I was a process abstraction painter when I was younger because I just love the idea of thinking through different materials and interactions. Problem was that since I hadn't taken printmaking, the idea of figuring out how to create evidentiary change with inside of something as you're actually advancing the print, I didn't quite know how to do that in painting and other modes of making until I started working with printmakers. And that has been a really big gift. As far as making work that's political, it has been a huge stress. I can't even say that this has been such a crazy time over the last, it's like, I thought I had a crazy life. And then this year has been really like pushing everything up to another notch. And I think having other artists who are working and trying to describe what it means to be an artist and to make work that's being political and not being negative to people who don't make work that's not political, but also trying to figure out where do you sit and what does activism mean for you. And it is, I think for me, it's about being an advocate for other people. It's about when I make a decision to do something, if it's helping other people, that's where it kind of lies for me. And I don't advocate everything. I do not, I'm it's complex, but I feel this sort of entanglement sometimes where, yes, it is just posting something and sending something else along to other people and being a part of the fluid motion. Sometimes it does mean that you're the front of the line and that you're the loudest voice. Sometimes you're at the back of the line and you're helping other people keep up. You know, like it's always, your positioning shifts. You have to think about how, and I think something about the nature of process and working through process over time is maybe more patient, and rather than thinking about I'm not doing enough, that maybe I'm doing what I can at the moment and maybe that's enough, but I'm doing something, you know, it's different. So hopefully that answers some of it, but yeah, it's a stress because sometimes I put something else out in the world which I think has a large political value. Sometimes I do something. Recently, I did this piece where it was a Republican with his head up his ass, and it was something I'd been thinking about for a while. And visually, I thought it was a very strong drawing. And I posted it on Instagram, and you know, whatever, it circulates, boom, fine, great. But it wasn't something that I felt comfortable with selling or putting into a place where it could be in a wall somewhere. It was more like showing people like this other side of my inventory, where it's stuff that are statements and things that you need to just make and process, that don't need to maybe be fully remembered representations of your larger process or your larger narrative of your work. That's kind of how I think about it.
As you can see, you just gave me a big laugh. I got to say, I want to see that.
Oh, have I showed you that one?
I haven't seen it, no.
I'll send it to you. Yeah.
You know, humor is such a big part of your work. Another question I wanted to ask, and
yeah,
it's sort of like what you were saying before with the source material. Like you want people to see something and then catch themselves and have that sort of brief moment of questioning and then go somewhere else. And humor, I think, has that a similar effect.
Yeah, I mean,
and then you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like in this dark humor, you know, it's like how I was raised with kind of dark humor. You know, you laugh and keep from crying, and a lot of people don't know. Some people don't know what that is. But you know, when certain things have happened and so many tragedies kind of stack up, when you're sitting there in a hurricane, or you're sitting there and you saw something blow up, or you just saw like something really insane happen, sometimes you just, like, at least for me in the way I was raised, sometimes you just laugh because you're like, I'm powerless. And I witnessed that, and I recognize my powerlessness. And so you kind of are just like, all right, let's try to enjoy it. I don't know, it's crazy. But like with the Negro Rifle Association flag, I've had people who were very strong supporters of another president, which I do, of Trump, and they would ask me, "Are you serious?" And I'd be like, yeah, sure. And then, you know, and I have to go down this line, and we get into these very interesting political conversations because of it. But the idea of humor for them and how they see it either as humor or threat, I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in like that line between someone being able to like, are you with me? How far are you with me? If I tell you this joke, is that okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? You know?
Mark, I think you bring up, you guys have both brought up a really important point. I think many of us have used humor in the last year or two to make it through some very difficult times. And there is one last question for both of you that I'd like to bring forward from Juliana Wisdom. She says, for Elizabeth, I'm curious how these pamphlets were consumed and by whom. It is my understanding that in the 18th century France, many bourgeoisie or much bourgeoisie was preoccupied with salons where they discussed Enlightenment issues like abolition, human rights, and democracy. How did these stories fit in, and could they be considered a distraction from the larger issues of the time, the pamphlets? How did the different classes in 18th century consume these? And then to Mark, the consumption and reaction to media also feels very relevant in your work. So I'd love to hear from you to both talk a little bit more about the similarities and differences in the power of media. And you've addressed some of this, but I did want to bring that forward.
Well, that's a great question, and it addresses something I didn't mention in the talk, which actually relates to the interconnectedness thing that we were talking about, Mark, which is that you have to think about that brochure and its illustrations as the beginning of something, not an end in itself. So there were street singers who made up songs that had to do with this tale. There were broadsides, a couple of which I showed. So even a lesser form of printmaking and cheaper form that people could buy and put up in their homes tacked to the wall, or just enjoy, looking at repeatedly. There were other types of texts that would circulate as well. Like I mentioned that there were newspaper reports and different types of newspapers, like the Journal de Paris, which is for those the bourgeoisie who are sitting in their salons. But then there's lower forms of journalism on cheaper paper, where journalists were recounting the different phases of his crime. So it really is. I mean, I chose to focus on the brochure and all the illustrations because everything's condensed into that one object. But really, there was just maybe not an ocean, but quite a lake maybe and river of other material that was riffing off of those illustrations. And there were actually lots of copies of the illustrations that sold, that were smaller, that sold at different price points. I think I'll stop there because I want to hear what Mark has to say.
No, because I was thinking about Le Poix, or like the pear, and I was thinking about like Daumier, and I was thinking about the idea of like the distribution of imagery that becomes something so synonymous with a certain event that's so particular that then everyone references it. It becomes the quickest, briefest way to kind of describe a larger situation that's happening. But I do think about the relevance of I use the idea of the media to kind of screw around with the hierarchies of what certain art objects in our society mean. So in the case of painting, and painting being this most like commodifiable object that like now when we're young painters, they'll make the same painting like 30 freaking times, like, and it's like, well, you might as well just print it. But no, it has to be a painting, because if it's a painting, then it's worth more, blah, blah, blah. So like I try to like upset that a bit by, yeah, I'll make a painting, but I also might make a drawing of it, and I also might make a 30 prints of it, and it's like about the idea of access, along with the idea of like, is it more important that people access the ideas, or is it important that the thing is worth a lot? And for me, it's more about the idea of accessing certain ideas and being in communication with individuals. So the tools, like the kind of salacious nature of like some of the things that were happening inside of Elizabeth's in that work, like I think about that a lot, and like the necessity to create a certain narrative around that individual. But then as it's interestingly perverse as they try to make it seem, and that this person from birth is just an evil person, it's a pretty flat way of actually describing this individual. And I guess like my question to you, what I wanted to ask is like, what do you think about like this flattening? Does that come into your thinking when thinking about like how these narratives, or how this story, or how the structure of these things kind of work? Like, as much as it seems like there might be some type of like input, but it's still kind of like, it's sort of like, by not giving the names of the doctors, by kind of keeping things in a general state, like what actually gets described in the narrative.
Hmm.
And I think like what gets described is that the state is right for doing what it did.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, except for that one really arresting etching, I mean, yes, I mean, he's rendered in this very generalized way that's almost, you can't really call it a portrait to an extent. There's so few, really unique or defining features. And he's reduced to just a few details, right? And I think you're totally right. There's a flattening, it's a simplification, that you don't get a sense of him as an individual. You just get this battery of bad acts. And it reminded me when you said that we're in a visual arms race. I thought that was such a great assessment of this current moment where we're inundated with images constantly. I think that's what they were going for. Just flood, flood the market with this similar, similar vaguely defined image of this person, because it's not about the person. It's about reinforcing that the facts as they occurred were just, that the state had the right and should have had the moral imperative to torture and kill this individual, and we're all safer for it. That was the line.
Do you think that like the idea of the serviceable, like we had this conversation before, and maybe I'm rethinking this a little bit or adding on to it, but the idea of the serviceable hand, or the idea of the anonymous hand, there's something interesting in it, because like as you look at it, and I think maybe if you were a person living in a time of prints or seeing information like this being disseminated, that what you would look for is the slight variations, perhaps, not just simply of a craft, but of hand, that would almost be, it almost works as gossip. It almost works as like, I hear it from a different source and the source tells it the same way, or they add something a little bit onto it, or they remove something from it. But the heart of it is true.
Yes, I completely agree. And one of the things that I think speaks to this is there's no images of him as a martyr, right? Even that one etching that is pretty great that I showed at the end.
Yeah, with the three,
where he's got the bruise and everything. It's not, you don't feel sorry for him. You look at him and you think, oh, this is, this diminutive guy. What's he about? It's not he's not elevated. He's not.
Well, I really, really hate to stop this discussion because it is fascinating and clearly could go on for a long time in many fascinating directions. But I want to thank, I know that many of our attendees need to move on to other things. And you guys, this has been so fantastic. I can't thank you enough. I hope the dialogue will have opportunity to continue in other venues. Mark, we look forward to seeing your work at IPCNY, and Elizabeth, we look forward to seeing your Enlightenment show one day. And I want to just take this opportunity as our concluding part of this 3-part program, the last 3 Fridays during IFPDA Print Month, to thank Sherry Young and Jenny Gibbs at IFPDA, and Judy Hecker, my partner in crime, and working on all of this with all of you, as well as our previous speakers, Rena Hoisington and Will Vialongo, and Jennifer Farrell and Joshua Kloss from last week. And really, I think this pairing of Old Master and Contemporary has been really fascinating. And this was a terrific way to end the series, because I think your discussion is particularly relevant to our moment. And so it feels really imperative right now. But I also, Mark, I look forward to meeting you in person one day and enjoy Philly. It's been a tough moment there this past week, but I hope things heal soon. And just want to say thank you guys. And for anybody attending, remember that tomorrow, IFPDA's final program is a great tour of Durham Press in Bucks County in Pennsylvania, and that will be happening midday tomorrow, and the URL to register has been posted in the chat. So cheers all, have a great weekend, and thank you guys again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.